Breaking news in Florida, the counting is over. That means the recounting begins. It is official. The races for Florida governor and the Senate seat are going to a statewide recount. The margin of each race was less than 0.5%, which triggers this machine recount. Now, in the Florida's governor's race, Republican Ron DeSantis is still ahead of Democrat Andrew Gillum by only 0.4%. The Senate race is even closer. Republican Governor Rick Scott leads incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson by just 0.15. 0.15, that's barely anything of a percent. Now, President Trump is weighing in on this recount. He's not mincing any words. He just tweeted an unsubstantiated accusation trying to steal two big elections in Florida. We are watching closely, he writes. CNN's Ryan Nobles is in Tallahassee, a town no stranger to any recount. Ryan, when did this all get started?
You know, honestly, Anna, it could happen at any minute. The way that recounts work here in Florida is that they're administered individually by each county. So depending on how the supervisors of elections want to handle their recount, as long as they get it done by next Thursday, they can start whenever they would like. So there is the possibility that the recount could start in some places as late as today, or we do think most of them will start first thing tomorrow morning. And, you know, we're already starting to hear the candidates react to this news that these races are so close that they're going to require a recount, many hearkening back to that dramatic 2000 presidential election where Florida was at the center of all the attention because of a dramatic recount. In fact, we just heard from a few minutes ago, I just left a press conference with Andrew Gillum, who's the mayor of Tallahassee and who also was the Democratic nominee for governor. You'll remember on election night, he actually conceded the race for governor. Well, he's talking a little bit differently about that concession today. Listen to what Gillum had to say.
I am replacing my words of concession with an uncompromised and unapologetic call that we count every single vote. We count every vote. And I say this recognizing that my fate in this may or may not change. What I do know is that every single Floridian who took time to go out, to cast their vote, to participate in this process, deserve the comfort of knowing that in a democratic society and in this process, every vote will be counted.
And so you heard Gillum there saying that he's replacing his concession, essentially withdrawing it. But he also makes it clear that he doesn't necessarily think that the outcome of this race is going to change. And privately, many of his aides feel the same way. They do believe that that margin of victory is perhaps too much for them to overcome, even in a recount. That's not the same tune they're singing in the Senate race. Anna, the margins are much closer there. That's where Democrats are focused. They do believe that there are enough votes for Bill Nelson to overtake Rick Scott, who's, of course, the current governor. But, Anna, we've got a long way to go before we know how this thing all turns out.
I want to talk to you about the American identity and what the midterms taught us. By the end of Election Day, we knew one thing for sure. America's political parties are as far apart as ever. The exit polling data shows a giant divide, a huge gender divide by party, huge generational divide, huge racial divide. Here's a quick example. This is just for the House races. Women voters, regardless of their age or race, overwhelmingly voted for Democrats, 59% to 40%. Younger voters between the ages of 18 and 44, no matter their race or gender, they supported Democrats by an even larger margin, 61% to 36%. So what group overwhelmingly voted Republican? Several, but white men in particular, 35% of all voters, they went Republican 60% of the time. Let's bring in political commentators Tara Setmayer, Keith Boykin, and Scott Jennings. Tara used to run communications for Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. Keith was a White House aide during the Clinton years, and Scott was a special assistant to President George W. Bush. And I want to start with you, Tara. A lot of data I just threw out there, but every one of those numbers represents real people. And if I'm watching this at home and I'm in some of those categories, do the parties just expect me to vote a certain way?
Well, I think that for minorities, they Democrats have felt that they are a reliable voting bloc, and the numbers have proven true. I mean, black women have voted overwhelming, over 95% for Democrats, reliable voting bloc. For Republicans, though, they have a greater problem looking forward. You look at the data for this election cycle, you saw almost a presidential election year type turnout. It was 49% overall. That's considerable. And a lot of that increase was due to millennials and people and women. So, millennials represented 55% of the increase in voter turnout this time around. And Republicans basically wrote that demographic off. And that's at their own peril, because they are the next generation of voters. And they're voting more and more Democratic because it's clear that what the Republican Party stands for now under Trump, they've rejected. And so have suburban women, which used to vote for Republicans, and the swing this time around was considerable, with suburban white educated women voting 20% more for Democrats. So this is a problem for the Republican Party moving forward, particularly if they become Trumpier.
Keith, do you think Tuesday's election result showed a growing divide, and where do you see that divide going?
I do think there was a divide. If you look at the voters who were under 45 who were white, they overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic candidates. It's white voters over 45 who voted for Republican candidates. No other group in the population is voting for Republican candidates.
But why aren't Democrats getting those voters?
Of the white voters over 45?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons that we can go back into studying America's racial history that goes into that. But the bigger question is, why aren't Republicans getting anything besides white voters over 45? You can't run a political party only tailoring to one group of people. Consider this, white men are 29% of the population. That's the group that Republicans do best at in terms of representing. But our country is increasingly growing, increasingly diverse. In this election we had on just a few days ago, look what happened. African Americans, we elected 2 black lieutenant governors, 3 black lieutenant governors. We elected 4 black attorneys general. We elected the first 2 Muslim women to Congress, 2 Native American women to Congress, the first openly gay governor. This is a reflection of where America is. We're an increasingly diverse society, and the Republican Party has to play catch up because the country that they want to represent, the country that Donald Trump is representing, is not where the country is going demographically. That's not a future recipe for success.
Scott, you hear what Keith is saying, what Tara is saying. If I am a young African American woman, for example, do Republicans even think about me?
Well, of course we do. Republicans think about everybody. Republicans think about giving the American dream to every single voter in this country, regardless of race or gender or geography. Anna, the divide I think a lot about living where I do in the country is the urban-rural divide. The Democratic Party no longer has much of a foothold in rural America, and the Republican Party doesn't have much going on in urban America.
Yeah.
The battleground in 2016 was in the suburbs, and a lot of right-leaning suburban voters did break for Donald Trump. Of course, in this election, the suburban voters tended to go Democratic. So if I'm thinking about Republican prospects for winning in 2020, I'm thinking about how does Donald Trump get back in the good graces of the center-right voters in the suburbs, and how does he not lose ground in the upper Midwest, where he did very well in 2016? To me, the clear issue is embracing what he says is boring, but what's not very boring for people who are living in it, and that's the good economy that's been caused by the Republican policies.
Tara, as somebody who used to be a Republican, who has been very critical of this president, I saw a tweet you put out in which you said, look, I'm voting for the Democrat for the first time. I can't believe I'm doing that. Does anything that you just heard from Scott resonate with you?
No. I mean, the reason it was more of a protest vote. I mean, I'm still a conservative, but my choice to vote for Democrats this time around was a hard one for me because of my natural instinct and my worldview is not in line with progressives. But I needed to send a message, because I could no longer stand by and watch the Republican Party continue to enable someone in this president who scoffs at the rule of law, who's dishonest, who's a bigot, who's a racist, who's a misogynist, and who is just making a mockery of the democratic norms, institutions, and ideals of our republic.
So you're talking about the very top of the party, which I know it's all about
right,
top
but
down.
It's cascaded down, and the Republican
when you feel
is,
distanced, I'm kind of talking bigger picture though. When you're talking about Republican Party versus Democrats, is it all
Right.
about the president, or is there a bigger issue here?
Well, the president is the face of the party right now, and so as long as party leaders are continuing in the vein of how Trump behaves and not holding him accountable, it's a reflection. I know a lot of people who said, I don't necessarily agree with Democrats, but we cannot allow Republicans to keep doing this, so we're going to send a message to repudiate them in order to course correct. So to Scott's point, yes, I hope that the Republican Party course corrects and learns from the shellacking they got in suburban districts, but that's not going to change as long as Donald Trump is the head of the party and people don't push back on him. That's the problem.